All right. Here we are. We are live for another week. And, you all that listen all the time, I know you're probably so exhausted and tired of hearing my super excitement about when all of that transition stuff happened seamlessly. But it did. And I'm going to be proud of it again. So, but tonight is going to be an awesome episode. And before we get into the episode, I know I wasn't here last week. I don't think I was the week prior. And that was right at that time of the most recent school shooting here in Nashville. And I will tell you all, since then, a lot has changed. A lot has changed in our state. A lot has changed, and I want to tell you why, and why I truly believe this to be the case is that I joined thousands of other youth at the Capitol, and I want to tell you the power of our youth, you all, watching them use their voices and advocacy for what they believed in was something that has lifted me up to heights and inspiration I never even knew I had. Standing next to youth and just listening to the passion they have for having a change in what's happened across our country. So if you're not inspired by our youth, you should be, because they have a sense of justice that I've never seen. They have a sense of advocacy that I've just never experienced. And so I want to start you off with that excitement, because a couple weeks ago, it wasn't that exciting. It was a lot of devastation. And I'm really excited to see what has been happening with our youth. And so without any further ado, I will tell Dr. Bocknek, I'm going to tell on myself before I do an introduction of you. I was at my child's track meet and looked down and was like, oh my goodness, I have a podcast in 20 minutes. So we have somehow accomplished to plan this whole thing out, get online, be ready for you all tonight. And it was nothing that Dr. Bocknek did. She was here. She was ready. But I wasn't. But here we are, and we're ready. So tonight's episode, which I think is episode 83, you all, which is mind-boggling, I'll be talking to Dr. Erika, and she's a university professor, a family therapist, a mom of 3. She holds a master's degree in couples and family therapy, a doctorate in childhood development. She has 2 postdoctoral fellowships in child psychiatry and infant mental health. She's an associate editor of the Infant Mental Health Journal and serves as on the editorial board of Adversity and Resilient Science and Infancy. She has been seen on PBS Newshour, Marketwatch, San Francisco Chronicle, and so much more. And I know how awkward it is to hear your own bio, Dr. Bocknek, but welcome and tell us a little bit more about the Dr. Erika Bocknek story.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt, for having me. I'm really excited to interact with your audience this evening. The Dr. Erika Bocknek story. Well, the most important thing to know about me that you did not say is that I'm a Jewish mom of 3. I've got a 6th grader, a 2nd grader, and a preschooler. And for me, everything that I do is about what kind of a world I'm shepherding these little souls into.
I tell when I was a principal and I would talk to parents, my first phrase was always, listen, the hardest job I have is not a principal. It is being a parent just like you. And I had parents be like, really? I'm like, no, trust me. I can handle 325 other people's children, but sometimes my own child can put me to the brink of insanity, right? So I get it, and I'm very proud father and also we were talking prior to a 12-year-old who likes track, and there I was with him. But let's jump into the conversation tonight, because you have a lot of amazing work and a lot of knowledge to share with us. And we were talking before about this idea of operationalize this work of trauma-informed work, right? And I think it's a topic that I hear a lot now that it has become, I don't want to even say mainstream, because it's not, it's still on the forefront, but it is becoming a bit more of a mainstream seat. So how do you see us operationalizing all of the context of this work?
Well, let me say this. This is, I think, an important starting point. I've been studying trauma for close to 2 decades, and I've been looking at this research question in a bunch of different ways. I was in New Orleans a few years after Katrina, and I've been in Detroit studying everyday families, and I was in Ann Arbor looking at the role of interpersonal violence in predicting PTSD and problems in the parent-child relationship. So I've really wondered about this in a lot of ways. And, it's sort of funny when you say it's mainstream. I often say when I started my career and I would tell friends that I studied trauma, people would often look at me sort of puzzled, like, how would you do that in the United States? Like, do you go to third world countries? And it was such a silly and certainly classist and kind of whitewashed idea of what the word trauma is. And it does feel like in good ways, there is now this broader dialogue going on about recognizing that trauma can occur in a variety of circumstances and contexts to a variety of people. And what I really like my students and my audiences to understand is that trauma is a very ordinary human phenomenon. It's actually not an aberration. And the reason that's really important for us to kind of level set here and talk about, even though, of course, Matt, I know you know that, I know many of your listeners know that, but the reason I really want to start there is because a big part of how we operationalize trauma-informed practice is under the assumption that this is an aberration, that it is an illness or pathology, that we need to sort of glue people back together so that they can rise to whatever the demands are of the system in which they are seated at the moment.
So talk a little bit deeper about that, because I agree, and we have a mutual acquaintance, and I will bring her up a little bit because she really digs into this of what you're just talking about. And there's a fine line, right, between, as practitioners, us feeling like we have to save people, right? Like, because, and I think people innocently and inadvertently get into the work with that idea of like, oh, we have to save people. When we realize, like you just mentioned, that trauma is, in whatever sense of that is defined as, is part of human experience in so many places. So how do we ride that line between understanding that this is life as an experience, right? And how do we come into this work seeing as we are part of a solution, but we are not the solution to someone else's situation or experience?
What a wonderful way to phrase that. So to back up, our mutual acquaintance is Dr. Addison Duane at Berkeley. She's so phenomenal, and I'm probably going to reference her work quite a bit in this podcast. And a story I'd love to tell actually about my work with her is that we co-taught a trauma course for graduate students. I don't know, was it last year or 2 years ago? Who can tell time these days? And one of the things we talked about at great length is that how professionals define trauma, you all have to know, is not a settled matter. And in fact, regularly there are debates about this at the American Psychological Association. There's a definition of trauma that's in the DSM, and then the next iteration, it's gone. And it really comes down to how we wrestle with whether or not we believe that there should be some universal framing of what is serious enough to create trauma, or if we should see this in a subjective way. And if we do the latter, what does that mean for how we define solutions? So I want to back up even a little bit and say, so that's going on in kind of one corner of the world. But the other thing that I can tell you from the family systems literature, now this is a group of, I like to think of them as sort of like mid 20th century hippies in the psychology world who were like, hey man, pathology doesn't exist in the individual. We have to really look at the whole family and the whole system. They weren't in some ways saying anything that was new in history that exists in so many contexts by so many scholars and has been made invisible actually in the psychology world. We know that relationships are the basis for human functioning from many sources of wisdom. However, one of their contributions was to say, let's see if we can look at trauma and stress in a relatively neutral way. What we know is that trauma is some sort of an unpredictable event. And when it happens, the person has to react in a primary way in the moment in order to survive it. And then there have to be a secondary set of reactions and adaptations that continue to protect safety and thriving. We then know that the outcome of all of that is some form of change. And that is on a continuum of maladaptation to adaptation. Now, the reason I'm getting really technical here about all of this is because what we've done that I think is doing a disservice to the field is to try to name only certain events as sources of trauma. And we see this everywhere. The ACEs framework, for example, prioritizes a very small subset of things as trauma. But if we are able to really hold in mind that trauma is really synonymous with being human, we are not good fortune tellers. So we are always running into unpredictable circumstances in a range of impact and horror. And we are constantly being called on to adapt to all of it. So being trauma informed to me is to, first of all, recognize that humanity. It's to consider the meaning and purpose about whatever it is we are doing in a moment where a traumatic adaptation may be challenging the output. And it's also about looking for ways to create better systems and contexts that are actually built for humans and not built for outcomes and products and deliverables.
You know, it made me think too, and don't even get me going on capitalism. I don't even want to get there, but I can definitely do that. It made me pull out. So for those who listen, you know, I'm constantly pulling out text, right? And I have my whole wall of previous guests and text. And when I hear things, I'm like, oh, I know there's some great content there. In Alex Chevron's book, Vanette, the Equity Center Trauma Informed Education book, you know, I love when she does what you just did, but she even goes a bit further where she's talking about just trauma as a basic and then adding the complexities and the impact of collective trauma too. And I think right now this is becoming an opportunity, an entry point for a lot of people, having, especially when we just be quite honest, the predominantly white middle to upper class demographic that maybe don't see themselves as experiencing trauma, but not looking at the systems and structures that have been around for hundreds of years that have oppressed people, so on and so forth. But this idea of what's happened with the pandemic, right? It is a starting point for a lot of people to now start seeing the ramifications of what happens to a collective impact situation that now impacts so many people. So what are your thoughts around that collective idea too, not just the individual, but systems and structures, and how that we again, going back to the word we started with, operationalize systems changed? Because there's this constant argument in this field of like, and I say it all the time, if I hear self-care for teachers one more time, I want to flip a table. And I know that's not regulating, I know that's not strategy. But it's like, wait, no. You can't self-care your way out of the situation that education is right now. This is a collective system shift that needs to occur. So how do you see that playing a role in our field when we're talking about the impact of collective trauma? And even if you want to go even further back into that historical impact of intergenerational trauma, how do you see it all playing out? And how do we operationalize all of those pieces as well while we're going, we've got these individual things, we've got this system things. Oh, wait, now we're juggling the historical context. How do you see it all fitting together?
So these are very complex topics. As you quoted from that book, there are more brilliant people than me talking about these really complicated systems level kinds of things, like Dr. Alex, who you quoted, Dr. Addison Duane, Dr. Lauren Mims, Dr. Simona Golden. These are people I'm really learning from in terms of these system level processes. Here's where I'd love to weigh in as a mental health professional. I'm not a teacher. I did a very brief stint as a preschool teacher once and loved it. And those kids stay with me forever, although they are adults now, because I'm old, you guys. But let me talk to you about it as a therapist and somebody who studies the mental health side of this. Because actually, in some ways, the advice I can offer educators is that it's more simple than I think we realize. The reason it's complicated is because we think we have to be expert on all the things that you just described, right? That we have to somehow hold a framing or an understanding of all of these things. And I really want to let people off the hook, because that kind of thinking actually is embedded in what is the kind of very common knee-jerk bid for power when we feel like we're under threat. Now, it's not, by the way, an inherently human instinct to do that. It has been socialized based on race, context, other experiences with power. But what I mean by that is that we all have experienced stress and trauma together all at once in varying ways at the same time. So whereas once we maybe were like, really, does racism exist at school? I don't know. Maybe now we're like, okay, I felt it too. Even if I'm a person who can't perspective take well for other people, I've now had my own experience. Now I know that this is a thing. And what we then go to try to do is be like, let me learn about all the ways that trauma can be conferred. And then let me develop worksheets to help people work through it. So what I really want to do is kind of simplify it in some ways. And this is what I want to talk about. We have come to talk about mental health as the we use words like emotion regulation, right? And when you hear that term, a lot of people hear that term, and what is brought to mind is that when I have a feeling and I want to manifest that feeling in some way, I need to control all of that. I need to depress arousal, reduce it. I need to make my behavior and my facial affect more neutral. And then we call it calm, but it's not. It's just suppressed. And listen, there are contexts where mental health is supported by suppressing your feelings and your reaction. For example, a police person pulls you over, that is the right process. But to overdo it and over-apply that process and call it mental health, what it's doing actually is decreasing relationality. And mental health isn't relationships as a byway to wellness. Mental health actually is greater connectivity. We are social beings. We have very few, natural predatory abilities in the wild, right? Why are we at the top of the food chain? It's because we relate and then we innovate. And it's the relating that is really critical to helping us to thrive. So that's all to say. I want to give that as a foundation, but that's all to say when you ask, how do we operationalize that? I really am pushing educators to think about reducing the harm in their own spaces. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I'm going to come back to it. But after you do that, what does a relational classroom look like? Throw out even the term trauma-informed for now. What would a relational classroom look like? Unfortunately, it would not include a calm down corner. It would not include individual worksheets. It would include some way to really make free space for full humanity to emerge. So very concretely, for example, that means that when children have to go to the bathroom, even if they've asked 9 times, there's an assumption of goodwill that that child needs to leave the classroom for some reason. And they have your respect, and then you have theirs. That's how relationships work. When a child, when the community has experienced a collective crisis, like a shooting, there should probably be no more tests for the rest of the year. That is not the only way to measure learning, and it is stressful. We need to think about ways to reduce energy output that is not thoughtful, and we need to really invite people to be their full selves. And although we can't get into that, I think in the detail that it deserves right now, I do want to refer your audience to work by folks like Dr. Lauren Mims, who talks about Black Create frameworks that are about intentionally creating spaces for creativity and humanity to emerge in education. There are so many people doing this work out there to learn about. That kind of work doesn't necessarily enter the same breath as being trauma-informed, but as a therapist, I really want to help knit that together for everybody.
Yeah, and I think most educators I may be making a massive assumption, would agree. And I think what I was alluding to earlier is the conditions in which so many educators are operating in don't allow it. And I say that in true honesty. This next week is testing week in Tennessee. And my thought is exactly, right? Like Nashville as a community has suffered a major impact.
Yeah.
I have friends saying their children aren't sleeping at night because they're terrified. I have parents texting me saying, my kid doesn't even want to go to school, right? And I agree that they shouldn't have to go to school and sit all day and learn while their systems are in a sense that they're probably not even learning anyway. And then now we're going to evaluate not their success, but the success of the teachers in the school based off of a test we know is extremely stressful in itself. I 100% agree with that. And I think, again, I don't want educators either to start thinking about, oh my God, there's nothing I can do, because there absolutely is. And I think that's, Dr. Bocknek, what I want to dig in further to, because you are right. And I don't know if you've listened to the podcast or if you've kind of heard the journey that my school was on, but we did a lot of what you said, not necessarily bathroom, because yes, theoretically that's great. But when you let a 15 fourth graders all go to the bathroom at the same time, kids are really smart too. It can also cause a lot. So we had to have systems in place, right? Yes, you can go to the bathroom. We actually communicated via an app so people knew who was in the bathroom, because believe it or not, kids will go and they'll fight sometimes. But one of the things we did implement was it was Be Well in School, where it was a co-regulation space with an adult, or an independent space if the kid didn't want an adult with them. And they could self-refer and go anytime they wanted, and they were never told no. Right? That in itself was so challenging for so many adults, because they felt like they were, quote unquote, relinquishing control. And at the end of the day, we took data because that's what we do, right? The average kid spent 3 to 7 minutes max. That was it. And in conjunction, we were teaching them through co-regulation. We weren't putting all of the weight on them to control themselves. We were doing it as a team and as a community. And it made a huge impact. But again, to me, it makes sense. But that means we have to start shifting how we view school, classrooms, and the work we're expecting kids. And it isn't, like you said, it isn't complex. But it is, because you have to be willing to step into a space of, all right, nobody's done this. We're going to try it and see how it works, right? We know the brain science. We know the neuroscience, or we know the neuroscience. We know the physiological science. We know all of this. So why don't we try? And I think that's what I hope see is fostered out of the work that's happening is, and you know what, when we did things, Dr. Erika, it didn't always work out. And we had to go, well, we tried it. That did not work as we thought, right? But I think there's a fear in education to get it wrong, so we don't try. And so what I heard you saying earlier is, you may not get it right, but that shouldn't prevent us from trying, right? So in an ideal world, right? In an ideal world, if you were the director, the secretary of education, and I know you, but that short stint in preschool, it matters. It does. It gives context. What would you say would be some of the major things that you would love to see schools explore and be able to think about? And I agree with you 100%. Reducing harm in your own classroom needs to be number one priority. Number one. So what would that look like? What would that look like from you, from a therapeutic standpoint, not from an educator, from a therapist? What would be the ideal?
Oh, well, I'd probably have a bunch of points on my plan, but I do just want to really iterate that fundamentally what I'm calling for is more of a mindset shift than a new way to program. I mean, look, your co-regulation structure worked for your school. That's great. What I hear you saying is that there are constraints we face as educators, and we have to get creative about how we build in relational functioning in a system that doesn't value it. But what I think I'm really calling for, and this is why I call it simple, I don't say easy, but I really want to be clear that I'm being straightforward. If enough people make a mindset shift in their day, even before we can start dismantling whole systems, even before we try to control the whole thing, if we enter into our own spaces as more human, I have seen the ripple effect. Now, I want to share with you an example actually as a parent, if you don't mind, because this is in direct response to like, well, we have to do state testing. What do we do? This is the shift. When I say to my own kid, who, by the way, has ADHD, he has anxiety, as do I, as do his father. His sisters are little, who knows? But like, we are a neurodivergent family, and we honor that. We talk about that. And what I say to him all the time is, like, school's stupid sometimes. The way that the learning occurs doesn't fit your brain. You are a big picture person. You need a lot of meaning in what's being delivered to you. You're very intellectually curious, and you need space to follow up on ideas and let your thoughts take you to new places. You're not going to be great at memorization, and you're not going to be great at answering test questions where there's a right answer, and it's not necessarily the most logical answer. It's just the right answer, right? These are like school-related skills, and they're a little bit arbitrary, and I've just given him all that. I'm validating what it is to be a human in these spaces. I've just said, this is taxing. I get it. However, you're going to be in school for like 12 more years. So you actually need this specific set of skills to get along in this system. If when you leave the system, you want to have as many choices as I had and Daddy had when we left college. We had a lot of choices because we played the game. If that doesn't matter to you, if you're planning a career that involves less training or has a lower bar for what your grades were in high school to let you into training programs, I support you. I don't care. But this is what you're facing. And that's kind of the mindset shift that I'm like, look, you're a whole human. I'm here to nurture your goals, your motivation. I'm here to be here for you. I'm here to knock around solutions, because obviously what he said next is, I do want to learn how to study. And I was like, okay, let's solve the problems. You study for 30 minutes, take a 15-minute break. Knock out some more homework, take a 15-minute break. He's like, yeah, let me try that. And so then I'm like, yeah, I believe in you. Let's try it. And then it doesn't work. And I'm like, okay, well, we still gotta, we gotta find another solution, right? It's that kind of a thing that I hope teachers can offer their students, is to say, I'm just like you. I'm a person who comes in the morning. I have good days and bad days. I have kids. I don't have kids. I love to knit in my free time. I'm, the child of an immigrant from wherever. This is what that's meant for me. I invite you to tell me about you. And then when kids do things that are, let's say, outside the box, we stop and wonder. We get curious. Now, that's something I know educators are amazing at. And I'm here to tell you that that is a mental health intervention.
Yeah, and she hasn't been on here, but I love this quote from Dr. Karen Treisman. I've been trying to get her on here out of the UK. She says, every relational interaction is an intervention.
Yeah,
that every interaction is an intervention. And I resonate with that a lot as a human, right? As my school experience, I remember moments in time that were true connection. And I also think, too, it's really important that we look at relationships not as a catalyst of compliance, but of true, authentic relationships.
That's the point. That is how we coat each other. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm so excited. My people are conversational overlappers. Have you ever heard that term?
No, please keep going.
That is the whole thing, is that those relationships cannot be transactional. And that's why I kind of push back on this idea that adults have to be like robotic and calm and and service oriented. Kids know, they figure you out. And you've got to really be there. And even if being there feels like flawed, that is better for the child. And that is in and of itself how you create trauma-informed spaces. Like, we're in this together, whatever will come. And yes, again, we want to think about these big things about how we dismantle systems, but if you don't mind, I'll tell you a story if that's okay. So I told Matt offline that I live in Michigan, and whenever there is a big crisis or a traumatic incident, I field a lot of phone calls from the folks who are primary to the situation, from colleagues who need case consultation. And so I get to hear a lot of things. I've got my ear to the ground. And after the terrible tragedy at Oxford High School in Michigan, where there was a school shooting, I must have met with thousands of teenagers in various groups. And what I heard time and time again from teens that weren't even students in Oxford, students in other high schools that had to go back into these environments with the awareness of risk, they said, "Can you stop ringing the bells between class? Because I jump out of my seat." And I was like, my God, like that is an easy lift actually for a school. It really is. And why did no one ever think about this? Because what we're busy with our energy trying to do is to take on the big problems that feel like they have no solutions. Let's start where we are. Let's talk about what it means to deliver education in this world as it exists. That is being trauma informed.
And I think part of that, Dr. Bocknek, is asking our kids. I was blown away when I started being a principal. Nobody had ever surveyed the kids. Nobody had asked them if they felt safe at school, if they had a caring adult, if they felt like they were bullied. Nobody ever asked the kids, how can we make the school better? I was very fortunate to be a leader in me school, where empowering kids and elevating their voices is really, really important. And it is amazing when you ask kids, guess what? They'll tell you. And here's the thing. We had a problem in the cafeteria. We just couldn't solve it. So what do? We brought a whole group of kids in and we set them around the table and they problem solved it. And they came up with the best solution possible. And I think that's where we miss. We don't see kids as being also problem solvers and don't see them as an active part of their own educational experience, because traditionally education is something we do to people, right? Not with people. And one of our listeners said there's also a shift that schools, it's really important for them to make, that schools aren't the only place of learning. And boy, I don't know who that is because your name isn't on here, but I want to raise that into the air. And when we're also going and talking about communities that are traditionally marginalized or communities that are not the norm community, that is imperative. And we have to be cautious not putting our individual lenses into the idea of what the world is for every individual. And I agree with that 100%, that there are so many learning opportunities that happen outside of school. I also want to say this too, and this is something that Dr. Addison, Dr. Alex Chevron, we've all had this conversation around. We also have to quit thinking that adversity and trauma and stress is something that only happens outside of the walls of our schools. And going back to what you said, Dr. Erika, if we can focus on reducing the harm in our own classrooms, that is a major shift. And it's a mindset shift. You are 100% correct. It's not about compliance. It's truly about authentic connection, meeting people in a human manner, in a human way. And I honestly regret even having this name, the Trauma Informed Educators Network. I wish it was not even healing, the empathetic trauma educators network, because that's what it comes down to. It's just being human. And I think that is such a key, that we have to be cautious when we're doing this work. And it really does come down to looking at ourselves as an individual. I do want to push a little bit and say, I don't want educators to feel they have to worry about systems change. Let people like me, let administrators, let people who are not in the work right now be your advocate for you and with you. Because I heard your example of you with your child, and that sounds very similar to mine. But I was also in a school where children never had an opportunity like that because they struggled at school. They were told they weren't good enough. They were told they weren't smart enough. They were told to sit down and be quiet. And then they went home to a parent who cared and loved so much for their child, but was also working multiple jobs, was also trying to make ends meet, was also struggling. I struggle sometimes as a parent. And like you said, I'm authentic with my kid. I'm authentic with the students. When a student was escalated and I was escalated, I would say this: I'm really frustrated right now. So I'm going to go to my desk and I'm going to I had a fidget that I used. I'm going to use this until I can get my brain calm. If you need one, grab it. If not, I need this for myself. Kids need to see us as humans as well. But so many kids don't get to experience, and this is not a savior complex. This isn't, oh, bless their little hearts. It's a realistic expectation that we have systems and structures of people that just don't get to operate in the space that we do, that we have to be cognizant of that, because school might be hard, and school might be the only place that they experience hard, right? Adversity. That was my case. But we also have kids that are experiencing on every front, and we can't expect every kid to come in and school work for them, whether they have every need met or they don't, right? It's just a place in which we have to start, again, operationalizing what does this look like for an individual educator, a school collective, a district, and a system. And it's called the socio-ecological model. We have to look at it from a systems and individual, because we can't expect the individual to change the system. We as a collective have to. And what you said, I'm going to go back to it, and I want you to expand a little bit. If we all collectively and individually begin to change our mindset, that then becomes the movement. So talk more about that, because I agree with that. And which is kind of why I have this hashtag Disruptors Unite. And it's kind of why we started the Trauma Informed Educators Network of 32,000 educators all coming together, because we're collectively saying, we all believe this. Now let's start this movement of, let's take this to all of our schools. Let's start having conversations. But how do you see that in a socio-ecological way of an individual collecting to a community, collecting to a broader system, collecting to the structure, collecting to the systems? How do you see that playing out? Because right now, I think we're just in the organizational of people are starting to get into the mindset.
So if I had my way and I could influence whole systems, this is what I would like to see. This is what I think starts to move our educational context to a more human place. But I do want to say that part of the problem here is the very structure of group collective learning is incompatible with what we know about how children learn things. The model itself is problematic. And so when we, as you've said, when we know a system to be inherently and kind of persistently plagued by systemic racism, what we're learning is that the system is problematic for everyone, and that in order to navigate it with some degree of safety, you need layered privilege. That's really what we're learning, right? So it's a little bit of a tough question to say, how would I modify the existing system? Because truly, if I was in fantasy land, I probably wouldn't. I would probably try to return us closer to the models of education that existed before the Puritans, which were mentoring models. That is how we learn best, actually. But it being what it is, in large part because we are in a society that aspirationally values children and families, but functionally offers no infrastructure. There's no money where our mouths are when it comes to saying family first. And schools exist as a plug in the drain of maintaining a system of productivity where the burden is on people who are early to midlife to produce the most and also produce the children. So this is like a very real thing, right? So like, how do we reform these systems? I struggle with it, but this is what I'll say. I borrow from the family systems literature, and there's this fabulous family therapist and scholar named Salvador Minuchin, and his model of family therapy suggested that health could be derived in large part from a couple of things having to do with the structure of the collective. And the things that matter most are A, very clear role definition. It's predictable to the children who does what. There's a clear collective goal in mind when role definition is created. And there's inherently a hierarchy because that provides some safety and a chain of command. The predictability means I know that someone's in charge if I'm the person being served. Having less power also means less responsibility, that those things are paired. right? And what I imagine that could look like in school, for example, is that I think, again, a fallacy a bit of how people operationalize trauma-informed thinking is that when somebody is harmful in some way or aggressive, we're supposed to understand intention and then kind of stop there. But the thing is that there need to be collective rules in place. And if we can think beyond justice and retaliation, if we could really think more about what it would mean to have safety in our environment. And again, there's lots of people talking about this better than I am. Mariam Kaba, for example, really talks a lot about safety versus justice. If we prioritized safety first and flourishing next, if we got down to it, right, and said, what are we all here to do? And who's going to do what best? It tells me, for example, the teachers need to be free to create these relational spaces and have autonomy in that way. The administrators, who have theoretically the most hierarchical power, need to take on the most responsibility when it comes to dealing with escalated matters in ways that serve, again, the human collective, that there would be some sort of protocol in place. As a really clear example of this, I was consulting with an early childhood center recently, and we talked a lot about the issue of behavioral problems in preschool. And this is, again, how I want to make it really simple. We could talk all day long, and we should, about the disproportionate rates of expulsion based on race and gender in the preschool years. This is a problem. Black children, and especially Black boys, are policed in early childhood environments. What the teachers describe they're confronting in general, because again, when something disproportionately impacts Black children, what we know is there is a systemic practice that is broken that's impacting everyone. So what I hear from the teachers is, but what do we do when there's a child whose behavior feels physically unsafe, psychologically unsafe, disruptive, persistently? What are the tools? Well, largely what often is happening at that age is that there's later down the road going to be a diagnosis made. And often it's because there's a neurodivergence that doesn't match the neurotypical environment. And the child is reacting and responding and low on energy to be navigating it. This comes up a lot. So I want to be really clear that when I say administrators need to be responsible for structure and safety, I don't mean that then the administrator's job is to come in and punish. What I mean is that the administrator needs to be an authority. And before the year even starts, the administrator is now, after this consultation period, is going to now say to parents when they come in at orientation, look, we're a community here. There's going to be at least some children over the course of this year that I need to have a meeting with the parents about and discuss the possibility of outside support. When I call you, I'm committing to you that I'm not going to wait until it's gotten bad. I'm not going to wait until the teacher is at her wit's end and doesn't know what to do, and the other children have started to develop a pattern of behaviors in response, ostracizing, for example. I'm going to call you early. I'm going to put my arms around you, and I'm going to tell you that we have a shared goal to make sure every child flourishes here, and we're going to put our heads together. I'm going to tell you that percentage-wise, some of your kids are going to be children who are going to struggle in this learning environment that's not built for everyone. And, you know, to sort of add a little humor, and I always say when you're going to those parenting classes, they teach you how to put a diaper on, but like those diapers are dummy proof. We don't need to be taught that. What we need to be told up front is you're all about to go on a journey. And if you think it's going to look like what you imagined, you're probably setting yourself up. Think outside the box. Know that 20% of kids have mood disorders. Another percentage of kids meet criteria for ADHD and autism. Our systems are not designed for this. And be prepared, be thoughtful. Don't wrestle with the shame. This is normal. This is everyone. And find communities to wrap their arms around you. And I think that schools can play that role. And so those are just examples of how I see this playing out. If we could really get a little more focused about what it is we're here to do unpack our assumptions about what it is we're here to do, and then figure out what a relational environment looks like in service of that goal.
Yeah, and I think I love that idea. But I also know, and I probably am more pessimistic, only because I know that the line of the DSM is not aligned to what we know science is telling us, especially around trauma. And I say that because I've had this experience. I served as a foster parent. If anybody listens to this, they know where I went. We had an assessment for one of my boys, and the psychiatrist at Vanderbilt University was like, "I've got good news and I've got bad news." I said, "What's the good news?" I was convinced, ironically, even after doing this work, that he had an intellectual delay. He did not. His intellect was, he was amazing, but his CPTSD was so bad that he was having a hard time processing in the frontal lobe, right? But this is what he said: "But I have to diagnose him with ADHD because schools can't and don't know what to do anything with CPTSD. They don't know what to do with it." So he had, for educational purposes, give him an ADHD diagnosis, even though he knew it was complex post-traumatic stress disorder. That's where I'm like, we've got to get beyond the pathology of it too, because it's not as easy as a diagnosis for kids. And we have to be cautious. And I understand what you're saying about the percentages, but I push back on the idea that everything is in the DSM right now, because it's not. And schools only identify 14 disabilities. That's it. Emotional disturbance is all of PTSD. That's the only thing it can fall under, where students can get disability, or OHI if it's under ADHD. But I think we have to be so cautious of worrying about how we're diagnosing kids and building structures and systems in schools, individual classrooms, and school structures, to not perpetuate the systems that are putting them in a trajectory to be expelled, to be in a school to prison pipeline. We know that it's real, because punishment has always been the go-to, right? As opposed to true, authentic intervention, skill building, skill teaching, and meeting kids where they are. So I struggle with some of that, in that I think it's even more complex than the diagnoses that we look at in schools. And I understand it is part of the process, but I've seen it be harmful, and I've seen it help. And I know each individual kid is different. But I told you we were going to go so quickly, so we're at the very end. So please let us know. What do you want educators to know right now?
Would you just give me 30 seconds to respond to what you
please,
said?
please.
I just want to make sure your listeners understand, and please forgive me because I'm not involved in the exact experience that you were describing, but what you just described is unethical clinical practice. A psychiatrist, first of all, should not be making a diagnosis of ADHD. A licensed psychologist should be providing gold standard testing. An ADHD diagnosis is not incompatible with a PTSD diagnosis, and somebody who's well trained should offer you a full evaluation and be able to offer a full treatment plan. Now, I know what you're speaking about is that on the school side, it's hard to get accommodations in place for a variety of life and human experiences, and I don't want to lose that point. I just want to make sure your listeners understand that we have a lot of problems in our mental health field right now related to this. And I just want to make sure that people walk away from here understanding that there are ethical practice issues that were embedded in that story.
Yeah, and I might not have been clear. This was weeks of assessment. This wasn't a diagnosis. He went and was assessed. And this is actually a Vanderbilt professor. So he is a top tier psychiatry professor. So please, if I did not clearly say that, this was a long process. This was weeks of us taking him, us filling out surveys, all of the work that went into. So I don't want anybody to assume that this doctor was unethical, because that definitely, I didn't get that as the case. We didn't go through school psychologists. We didn't go through a school assessment. We went through outside testing, because we wanted that deep testing to understand. But I hear what you're saying, and I do know that does occur, and especially with ADHD, I've seen it. I've even worked with medical doctors. We, as a principal, who would pass them out by a quick little questionnaire, and I knew ethically that wasn't. We actually turned that individual in because it was coming. So many kids were coming with that diagnosis from the same doctor that we had ethical concerns. But we're at the end, and I'm going to have you back on because we're going to have to continue this conversation. And I know it feels kind of cut short, but we are right at 50 minutes. And I promise you, I will send you another invite. We're going to continue this conversation.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, maybe we have Dr. Addison on as well. I've been trying to get her on. Maybe we all three can join a conversation around this topic. So what do you want teachers to know before you tell people how to get a hold of you? What do you want teachers to know right now?
I hope if you take anything away from this conversation, it's not the daunting nature of trying to be a teacher in this world, though Lord knows that's something you're facing. It's a difficult profession, and I applaud you. What I'm really hoping you'll take away is that there's so much about who you are and that you are enough by showing up, and so much more that then will tumble out of that mindset shift you make in relationships with the kids that you teach.
Fact. Well, thank you so much. So if people want to follow you, follow your work, where can they find you?
Please check out our website, myconvo.org. I have a whole team there, including a former educator and now psychologist who's available to consult with teachers in schools, Kim Stokes, as am I, of course. And you can book a session right there on the website. And also please follow along on Instagram at Dr. Erika Convo.
Awesome. Thank you. And you probably already know this. If you don't know, you can follow the podcast at the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast on Facebook. If you want to follow the network, if you haven't already joined, the Trauma Informed Educators Network is a social media group on Facebook. It is a private group, so you have to search it. It is 32,000 plus practitioners, parents, principals, everybody. Advocates are in there. So join the group. If you haven't liked our page, please like the page. I'm really excited that we've now passed 50,000 followers. So please follow that. As always, too, just so you all know, we have the conference coming up. And Dr. Addison, Dwayne, she's getting a lot of love today, but she's going to be presenting. We've been talking about her and so many other people. The registration is open. It is actually virtual this year. It's June 22nd and 23rd. 25 sessions, all will be recorded. Anybody that registers will get access to all of those sessions. Dr. Lori Desautel, who was on here just a few weeks ago, will be one of our keynotes. Robin Kogan, also known as the Relentless School Nurse, will be a keynote. And then my partner in crime, Dr. Ricky Gibbs, will be bringing fire as the opening keynote. So you all, if you have not registered, register for that. It is going to be a great couple days. And then lastly, some of you might or might not know, but Trauma Informed Educators Network now has a new website. It's tienetwork.org. There is a team there as well. Have a team of practitioners, all either in education or have been in education, helping schools begin to have these conversations that Dr. Bocknek and I just did. About how does this look in school and how do we transform school cultures from an individual all the way up to the systems within a school? How do we begin to have that conversation? We do that. So please join. And then lastly, a lot of announcements. If you're not part of the global gathering, I cannot tell you how amazing the first 2 months of the global gathering have been. We meet from 6 to 7 p.m. Central Time on the second Tuesday of every month. It is a way to join like-minded people, connect, have conversations, build your network, and the cost is awesome. It's free, just like this podcast. So if you want to come and join the conversation, last Tuesday we had 5 countries represented. And so this really is a global perspective. So you're going to hear from people from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and of course across the US and hopefully from the UK if we make an adjustment to time. But you'll hear from people all over the globe. So if you haven't joined that, you can go to the website, TIE Network, go to resources, click Global Gathering. You can register on Eventbrite right there. But we hope to see you. And lastly, as always, something awesome. All right. For those of you who are live with us, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your comments. Patricia Sutherland, she says, thank you, Dr. Erika. Thank you all for being here tonight. I will be back next week. Next week is going to be, I'm really excited about, just like tonight's conversation. Next week is a friend of mine, and I cannot wait for you to hear from her. She has a perspective that I think is going to be extremely important given the political climate of today. She has transitioned in her life as an adult and wants to talk to educators about the life of the living life of a trans experience and what is happening across our country and in schools for youth like her. So I hope you all will join us next week for that amazing guest. And as always, thank you all for listening. Please share, give us a like, give us a review. Really appreciate that. It just pushes the podcast up and more people get to have access to it. So thank you all. Have a great night. Dr. Erika, if you'll give me 1 second. And thank you all. See you next week.